everybody, Dr. Rob here. I've got strength coach extraordinaire, a guy who is going to really share a lot of insights on the circadian rhythm, Mr. Robert Jacobs. Rob, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
I'm happy to have you. I'm happy you're here. So for me, I'm going to give a very basic definition of circadian rhythm, and then we're going to watch you take it and elevate it a whole bunch of floors on a great staircase here. Circadian rhythm is the physical and mental and behavioral changes an organism experiences over a 24-hour cycle. How you feeling about that?
I think that's perfect. I like to know the real nitty gritties of this kind of stuff because I really think it helps. I didn't fully understand the magnitude of the circadian rhythm until I understood it at a very molecular level. And it's because a lot of people, well, why do I need to care about this? Isn't it just my sleep wake cycle? And that really tends to be what most people just, all right, if I go to bed and when I wake up, I've reset my circadian rhythm. But I really want people to understand that, circadian rhythms they're in all parts of life. The clock system is found in all cells in the body. And the circadian rhythms have a regulatory role essentially in every aspect of biology or physiology and every cell on this planet. And one of the things I like to try to educate people on, using some analogies, is that every gene in the human genome has a clock gene in front of it, basically. And so what this means is the clock genes are these things called transcription factors, right? And these things bind specific segments of DNA that are called response elements. And these response elements are just short sequences of DNA that regulate the transcription of our genes. And once these clock genes are bound, these transcription factors can turn on or turn off the downstream genes. So really, these circadian genes and the circadian rhythm controls, all of the genes in the human body. And to easily kind of get a concept of transcription and translation, I like to use an analogy of a chef that doesn't speak English at a restaurant. And so when you're looking at transcription and translation, you have a world-class chef that speaks French and the rest of his staff speaks English. Well, you have to have one person, or the sous chef, that can take the French recipe from the master chef, transcribe that into, or translate that into English, and then transcribe that to the rest of the staff. And that's really how DNA, transcription translation kind of works. And that's kind of the hard hitting heaviness of the circadian rhythms, is that it has that genetic control over essentially every gene in our body.
Wow. So wait a minute. So there's a gene receptor in every cell of our body that's tied into our circadian rhythm, our rhythm with outside. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
So when I travel, and as you know, I have a pretty extensive travel schedule. So I'm in the East Coast. Everybody knows that. So I go to the Midwest a lot. I go to the Pacific Northwest. Sometimes I go to Pacific, Hawaii, if I'm lucky, every couple of years. Anyway, it's typically an hour to change. I don't change my clock, which is my cell phone. I still live my life on the East Coast, and everybody thinks I'm crazy because I'm trying to stay in my circadian rhythm. You're telling me if I switched my proverbial clock for the weekend, every gene in my body would understand that, and it would have a detrimental effect, conceivably.
So there's several ways you can try to manipulate the system, and a lot of it really depends on how long you're going to be in either a different time zone or a different environment. If you're traveling on Friday, speaking on Saturday, and coming back Saturday night, then not trying to really make that many adjustments is probably going to be better for your body, rather than trying to switch one time zone and then immediately switch back. But one of the important things is that these rhythms we call it entrainment. So the rhythms can be entrained by light, they can be entrained by exercise, by feeding behavior, by social behavior. All of these things can manipulate the circadian rhythms, but they do have to be synchronized. So one of the things that another really good analogy is to think about GPS. So if you think about the way GPS triangulates your location, the satellite in the sky is essentially equivalent to the master clock in the brain, whereas the GPS in your phone is the circadian rhythm of your pancreas and the beta cells in the pancreas, or the interchromaffin cells that in the gut that deal with serotonin and all those types of things. So if the clock in the brain or the master clock isn't synchronized to those peripheral clocks, then that's where you can start to have the dysfunction or phase shifting, we call it, where your body is expecting the light to trigger a pulse of increased ghrelin and HCl production and all these these hormones and peptides that we know are associated with morning appetite, cortisol awakening response, all this big cascade, which is primarily all driven by light, which then has to be synchronized peripherally. And it's that desynchrony that can really be a big issue. So not tapping into synchronizing the clock with the light in your eyes versus the peripheral organs can be one of the biggest causes of dysfunction or cellular dysfunction that we've been aware of so far, now that we know about all these things.
So go over entrainment one more time.
Okay, so the way this system works is that the rhythms are essentially reset, right? Or we call it entrainment, or synchronization is a really good way to think of it. And now the rhythms are present. If you put a human in complete darkness 24/7, 365, the rhythms are still there, but their speed changes. So a 24-hour rhythm might become 27 hours, 28 hours, 30 hours, as you become encased in darkness, essentially. So what we do with the entrainment is that the way the system was designed is that the light is the primary entrainment mechanism for the satellite in the sky, whereas all of the exercise, your feeding behaviors, all of those types of activities are the entrainment mechanism, or the primary entrainment mechanism for the peripheral clocks. And we have some people who do really good about some aspects of it and some people who are really bad about some aspects of it, but it's that synchronization that can really help the system correct issues. And Mother Nature has sort of built remedies into a lot of these systems with seasonal availability and the way the light cycles change, and you're supposed to sleep longer in the winter, and you're supposed to be more active in the summer. And there's seasonal rhythms that go along with longer light cycles, and there's actually a neuropeptide in the brain that is increased or driven by carbohydrates that actually makes the master clock in the brain slightly less efficient, which facilitates a longer day or a longer circadian cycle, which you would want when carbohydrates are available, which is naturally in the longer light cycles. So Mother Nature sort of built in a lot of these connections that sort of facilitate this social synchronization along with the light synchronization in the brain.
So the light is the mechanism to start the fire, if you will, or to start the clock.
Yes.
So that's why cavemen, if we could go back that far, actually had a good circadian rhythm, because they got up at light and went to sleep at dark. Some of the problems that we have now with light being that mechanism is that we have light 24/7, 365. And I see a lot of people wearing orange and blue lights, orange and blue screens to knock out the light. I hear a lot of people saying, don't watch the TV an hour or play with your phone an hour before you go to sleep. Give people like 3 hacks to dim the stimulation of the light late at night so they can stay in sync with their circadian rhythm.
So a lot of the phones now have the some of them are called night shift. Like it has night shift on my laptop, some sort of night light feature on most cell phones, I would say now. So what we want to start doing, what the brain and the eyes have the ability to do, is sense and perceive the frequencies of light as they change from sunrise to midday, as they change towards sunset. And each of those times of day, the different opsons in the eyes perceive that light and have different mechanisms. So a really good one to kind of understand how the light changing in the day can help you is that the bluer light that's more present in early sunrise increases cortisol, triggers the cortisol awakening response, and those sorts of things. But as more ultraviolet light comes into play towards mid-morning, towards mid-afternoon, that actually degrades in the blood cortisol and norepinephrine. So there's natural mechanisms there via light, on the skin and through the eyes. So I think all the blood volume in the body passes through the eyes every 40 minutes. So irradiating the eyes with natural light or artificial light has very potent mechanisms. So not only with effects in the blood, but also with on the skin with the signals in the eye. So one of the primary things that you could do is in the evenings is mute the overpresence of blue light. One of the things I've heard some fairly smart researchers say is that blocking blue light isn't that beneficial because it's a natural frequency of light. But when you look at the technology, there's no balance. So there's lots of blue light in sunlight, but 48% of all sunlight is in the red frequencies, in the red parts of the spectrum, which is the Mother Nature's kind of natural remedy to blue light, is that it's always balanced with red light. So if you're not blocking artificial blue light, it doesn't make sense to not block it because it is not present in a natural way. So, wearing the amber colored lenses, the yellow lenses, these are blue blockers that I wear, when I'm working. So they're a little bit more efficient. They're not quite as dark. So blocking that blue light from your screens, changing the bulbs in your home, all these things are really big needle movers because, like candlelight indoors when it's dark outside isn't necessarily the most efficient form of lighting. We give used to give the paleo community a little bit of a hard time, because toilets aren't necessarily paleo either, but I think that's a huge advancement in technology, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the same sort of thing with lights. One candle, if you fall down the stairs because you're using candlelight instead of turning your overhead light on, that's not necessarily a healthy evolutionary adaptation. But you can use things like incandescent bulbs, which are probably the closest man-made light to the flame wavelengths and spectrums, which have the least amount of melatonin suppression. You can use things like halogen bulbs or full spectrum bulbs, during the daytime. Several of those, little things are really big needle movers and don't necessarily cost, the cost of getting a cold plunge or a sauna or a giant red light panel.
So we've got blue light and we've got red light, and that's in the visible light spectrum. Yep. So it's interesting that you mentioned that because a little off script, we now hear a lot about red light and its medicinal effect. I'm a laser guy, so I use a lot of violet and red. And it's funny, there's a laser that I use that has shown to have good data on syncing with the circadian rhythm, and it has violet and red light. So you were preaching to the choir when you said that to me. Just to recap, let me see if I can get everything right. So circadian rhythm is your body's internal clock. It's regulated by a part of your hypothalamus. Typically, it's 24 hours in length. Factors that influence the circadian rhythm are brain hormones, stress, light and dark, and I know we're going to get into the timing of the meals. A disruption in your circadian rhythm leads to difficulty in falling asleep, difficulty in maintaining sleep, waking up too early, sleeping too late, being chronically not restorative, poor quality sleep, just fatigue during the day, daytime impairment, and believe it or not, I'm going to add one thing. They talked about if you have trouble sleeping 3 times a week or more, your circadian rhythm gets busted. They call that insomnia. So it was one thing that I added in that I wanted you to take the mantle with, and that was food. Let's talk about food's effect or circadian rhythm's effect on food and your choices of food.
So there's really, really good data for us on this, and we are wired essentially the way the system works. There's a circadian rhythm to substrate oxidation at the most fundamental levels of the mitochondria even. So if we think about the macronutrients, protein and carbohydrates and fats for what their purpose is, fats are for a bit more of a sustained energy. Carbohydrates are a bit more of instant energy. You don't need instant energy before you are preparing to go to bed. And, it's funny how the system sort of works that way because you see dramatic shifts in the fuel substrate, so fatty acids or glucose or carbohydrates in the mitochondria, and how the mitochondria flip the switch to burn fat while you're sleeping. And we've heard many times you should sleep in a cold, dark room, and sleeping in a cold room helps you burn more fat, right? But if you are having carbohydrates before bed or too close to bed, and you have any sort of insulin or glucose dysfunction already, you're not going to switch the fat burning switch because you've put in carbohydrates. So your body is going to try to utilize those carbohydrates preferentially. So one of the important things to understand about these concepts is that the clock genes drive variations in nutrient utilization. And there's some really key ones, that we can hit on. There's the bioavailability of amino acids and protein are dependent on day-night oscillations that are modulated by the circadian system. So one of the things my mentor, Charles Poliquin, was a big fan of was, high protein, meat and nuts types of breakfast. And when we look at the research on the circadian rhythms, more protein at breakfast equals more muscle mass. And when we look at the genes, when you have more protein, so if you look at isocalorically and all those things, if you have more of your protein at breakfast than when you have it at dinner, you see increased expressions of IGF, MYOG, MYF5, right? All these myogenin transcription factors, right? So now we're transcription translation again, that are influenced or controlled upstream by those circadian genes. And these things essentially increase satellite cells, myonuclei into the skeletal muscle. They increase skeletal muscle response to hypertrophy. So if you are someone who likes to lift weights, having more protein at breakfast actually increases your skeletal muscles' natural response, or it facilitates an improved response in overloading induced hypertrophy.
So you're designing diets for your clients, for your patients, based on how they respond to the circadian rhythm. I feel that tidal wave coming. So Absolutely. If I asked you, hey, Rob, let me ask you a question. What diet do you adhere to? Is it the carnivore? Is it the paleo, like you mentioned? Is it the keto? Is it the Mediterranean? Is it high protein? And your answer is going to be
all the above. These circadian rhythms, one of the frameworks I like to use, the fad diets, are really helpful conceptually, because essentially you want to be a little bit more on the keto side of things at breakfast, with obviously adequate amounts of protein, right? Because we're going to provide a sustained amount of energy early in the morning with protein for our brain function, for our immune system function, all those things. And then at lunchtime, that's when you want to have 80% of your carbohydrates for the day at lunchtime, because that's the middle of our day where we need a quick instant source of energy when we're trying to be productive, when we're trying to do things. And so, so sort of a keto-ish breakfast, a vegetarian-ish lunch with obviously adequate amounts of minimal protein, and then more of a carnivore-ish type of dinner, because we know we want the bulk of our protein and our fats at breakfast. Now at dinner time, if your circadian rhythm is functioning properly, we know cortisol should be on the way down. It should be pretty low by dinner time if you're functioning properly. And if that's the case, you can absorb and assimilate nutrients more efficiently than you can at breakfast time. So whereas you may need to consume 40 grams of protein at breakfast to get your minimal absorption, your minimum amount, you may be able to get the same amount of absorbed amino acids from less protein, because your cortisol is down, your digestion should be improved. And again, we don't need sustained or instant energy at 6, 7, 8 p.m. before we're getting ready to go to bed. So we don't need tons of carbohydrates at that time.
I love it. So your layout, your map is similar to mine for different reasons. And then let's hit that common ground so all the listeners get real excited. So I say the same thing as you do. I like a break fast, because I have a lot of intermittent fasting with people in the morning, mostly proteins, some fats. I try and avoid carbohydrates because I'm hoping not to break people out of their autophagy. We haven't proven that yet. Then at lunch is when you're going to have your carbohydrates. You said a vegan type diet, because that's your best time to have your carbs. And at night, we're going to protein and vegetables, because the vegetables have a lot of minerals like calcium and magnesium and potassium, which enable you to get a better night's sleep. That said, intermittent fasting resets the circadian rhythm. Or is it the circadian rhythm, Mr. Jacobs, that resets and works with the intermittent fasting?
I think that both of those systems work very well together, because one of the things that we know from a lot of the intermittent fasting research, or time restricted feeding, depending on what label you want to put on it and how you're applying it, everyone should be fasting through the evening time. And that sort of ties back into the circadian rhythm of substrate oxidation. If you're eating too close to bedtime, we know that there should be a bit of a paralysis of peristalsis through the evening, right? You're not supposed to be digesting food while you're sleeping, and that can lead to, substantial issues. And there's really good information and data on a seasonal aspect also to things like intermittent fasting and time restricted feeding. You're not evolutionarily, in terms of evolutionary biology, and in particular the circadian rhythm, food's not easy to come by in the wintertime, or if you're in the close to the equator in the hot season versus the wet season. So even applying an annual type of rhythm to things like time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting, depending on what issues you're trying to actually correct as you do that, the wintertime is one of the best times to do a bit more of that, because that ties into, things like not having tons of carbohydrates available, because, well, in the wintertime, they're not available depending on where you live. And we know that lack of carbohydrate in particular, but also a bit of, caloric restriction and some of those types of things are what facilitates the increase in NAD plus that can sort of repair the some of the telomerase issues, that can do a lot of the things with longevity and activate the sirtuins and get all those types of effects with autophagy and even enhancing apoptosis in a positive manner. The basically the beneficial things that we know of already with intermittent fasting and time restricted feeding.
Well, you just opened up Pandora's box, so to speak, because there is a lot to unpack right there. So let's talk about daily eating. Let's go back a notch, and we talk about it in light, no pun intended, of, I think you're saying when it gets light, we should have our breakfast, our first meal. Yes or no?
Yes.
Now the data is strong, and I get yelled at, that the best thing to do is eat in the morning and not eat too late in the day, sort of by 4 to 6 o'clock, when most areas of where we live, it begins to get dark. So that intermittent fasting and circadian rhythm are really interlinked. Now, you just talked about a seasonal circadian rhythm. Now you just talked about the incisive topic of 2024, and that is longevity. And one of the hacks that everybody talks about, whether it's Mark Hyman, Peter Attia, Rob Silverman, Rob Jacobs, whoever, talks about intermittent fasting. But we don't talk about resetting the circadian rhythm as a longevity hack. But you made a great case for that.
That's probably the greatest longevity hack that you could employ. And if we look at, things like supplement protocols and great diets and all these sorts of things, and understanding the circadian rhythm at the point of that transcription translation level is really what helped realign my thinking, is that all of these things are great and we see supplement protocols work, but we also see them not necessarily work for a long time. We don't necessarily see them reverse conditions. We see lots of clinicians that can get sort of caught in the functional medicine equivalency of, take this for that, and lots of those types of things without addressing the actual machinery that is not working properly. So we know that the circadian rhythm, if you can fix that first, then your supplement protocol is going to work better. Your dietary adjustments are going to work better. All of these things. So one of the interesting things about, daily rhythms that I think sort of helps illustrate this point is that we know pretty conclusively that adults with normal glucose tolerance in the morning are metabolically equivalent to being pre-diabetic in the evening. And so this is one of those things. So you can imagine, well, if you're normally pre-diabetic in the morning now because your dietary system and, your past has led you down that route, well, you're going to be way worse in the evening. But we know that is a normal rhythm that is in response to light, that is a diurnal rhythm from essentially with the pancreas, because insulin production goes down. And if we look at the broad circadian rhythms of that, it ties into leptin, it ties into prolactin, it ties into growth hormone, it ties into all these things that are supposed to occur during sleep. Because one of the things that we know is that the way the rhythms work, for leptin to get into the brain, to bind to the leptin receptor in the hypothalamus, that is a pretty important domino in the circadian rhythms during sleep, insulin needs to be on the way down, right? Because leptin is not going to be up if insulin is up, right? Those are two different responses. And it's the same sort of thing with like leptin and ghrelin. You don't have a hunger hormone when the fullness hormone is in effect. So insulin has to be on the way down so that leptin can be on the way up to trigger those dominoes of prolactin, which then triggers growth hormone. We know growth hormone has huge impacts on non-REM sleep, on delta waves, on sleep efficiency, sleep quality, all of those things that can all be heavily influenced by poor dietary choices simply at night. And one of the data points that we have is just shifting dinner back 2 hours increases the 5-hour glucose areas under the curve at that dinner and breakfast the following morning. So, when you look at intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding, all those things, if you're not abiding by the daily rhythms of substrate oxidation, that's one thing you could start doing that could make your intermittent fasting protocols work better. Because we know that if you have that higher carbohydrate meal, it's going to mess up insulin and glucose that night and 12 hours later.
That's fascinating. So I'm going to come to you right now. I want a training program. How are you going to assess my circadian rhythm? And then how are you going to program and plan my workouts based on that? Because I think that's what everybody was going to want to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So we also know that there's a different response to exercise, training in the morning versus training in the evening. And this sort of relates to substrate oxidation. So, it's simple questionnaires and understanding what your light hygiene is. If you're like most people, wake up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, they turn on artificial lights, they've checked their phone, they've checked their work emails, then maybe they go have a liquid whey protein shake that doesn't include any fats of any kind. And we've already messed up our insulin and our circadian rhythm's already off. And guess what? You've probably got bad digestion as a result of it. And you might need to take HCl because you wake up too early and you're eating at the wrong times of day. And your evening routine is, rubbish on top of all that. So a simple understanding of light hygiene without any lab markers gives you a really good indicator of what the circadian rhythm should be functioning like. And you can go one step further and look at some lab markers. You can look at an ASI, a 4-point salivary cortisol curve. You can look at the relationships between DHEA and pregnenolone and progesterone, some of those things to sort of see how and even melatonin, right? And how some of those things are functioning to really get lab data of, yes, your circadian rhythm's probably off. And it's simple things too, because we know now that everything does have a circadian component to it. Anything that's not functioning properly is most likely going to be benefited in some form or fashion by synchronizing your circadian rhythm or having some of those circadian habits be better, with your morning light, with your evening routine. So that's a pretty easy dissection. And, it's also pretty safe to say that most people are dysfunctional in that aspect because, you can give someone HCl digestive enzymes while they're fixing their habits and then hopefully not need to take that forever. But if you're not addressing, sort of essentially the root cause, which is most likely the circadian rhythm, because if that wasn't dysfunctional, you're less likely to have some dysfunction. And so when we look at time of day, you come to me and you say, all right, we're going to train at 8 a.m. every day, 9 a.m., whatever. That's a different response metabolically or preferential. Now, what we have to do is now we're getting into interdisciplinary studies, which can make things a bit murky. But, essentially, people have trained all sorts of ways in the morning, all sorts of ways in the evening and gotten great results. But if we can take the response that the system naturally gravitates towards in the morning and train you in a way that facilitates that and feed you in a way that facilitates that, you're going to get better results. And some of those aspects are increased BCAA catabolism. So we know you're relying on the branch chains in particular a bit more than some of the other essential amino acids. The enzymes and proteins that upregulate MCT synthesis are enhanced following and around morning exercise. Glycolysis is enhanced in following morning exercise, whereas the TCA cycle is actually downregulated. So you see buildup of metabolites from alpha-ketoglutarate, fumarate, malate in that lower portion of the TCA cycle. So you can start to see that you're not utilizing carbohydrates as fuel when you exercise in the morning. So if we can train in a way that corresponds to your body's preference, utilizing things like a high protein, high fat breakfast so that those are our primary fuel sources, utilizing things in terms of work to rest ratios that call upon triglycerides and free fatty acids rather than glucose or the ATP-CP system for your primary fuel sources for morning exercise. We know we can get you faster results, because we know everything works basically, right? You can do 100 push-ups every day and eventually you'll get better at that. But, in my business, the name of the game, much like yours, is getting better results faster than the guy down the street. Really? And this is one little hack that you can do by training in a way in the morning or the evening. So when you look at the evening, it actually facilitates a little bit differently, right? Because you're supposed to have already had your carbohydrates in your system. So evening exercise, you actually call upon glucose pathways. The TCA cycle is upregulated. You deplete hepatic glycogen in the evening time in response to exercise, whereas you deplete skeletal muscle glycogen in response to morning exercise. So, essentially that tells us you want to be a bit more Tabata interval, kind of HIIT style weight training in the morning, more fatty acid oriented in the morning, whereas in the evening you can facilitate a bit more mind muscle connection style of training where you're chasing the pump and depleting the skeletal muscle because you're utilizing more carbohydrates for fuel when you train in the evening, because that's when you should have prior to that, you should have loaded those carbohydrates into the system already.
So you're able to determine the dietary intake over timing with the circadian rhythm, wrapping it up in a nice tight bow. People used to train before, and I've always said this. In some ways, I'd like to refund money to people that I saw in my first 5 years in practice versus the next 20. But then again, if I refunded it, I have to charge those people more. So I'm not asking you for that. But from the time that you started to train people to you learned about the circadian rhythm and really became an expert in implementing it, what are the changes in their outcomes?
The results are there faster. And that's, one of my buddies has a gym and their tagline is 3 years of results in 3 months. And that is, that's one of the things, while that might not be exact, but that's sort of the idea. You can do things like having tempo to your exercise, making sure your rest time is specific, and training certain ways that get you faster results than training other ways. And one of the more useful things is what happens a lot in this industry is, people will train like one guru and then try to eat like another, but those two systems don't necessarily go together. And that's another really good way to marry some of this stuff is, Vince Gironda's diet worked great the way Vince Gironda trained, but Milo Sarchev's diet's probably not going to do very well if you train like Vince Gironda, because those are way different, philosophies and styles and just methodologies in general. And that's probably one of the biggest changes that I've made that enhanced results, is starting to see that you can't necessarily mix and match everything. But if you have a client that can only train at X time of day, there's lots of things you can do now, because all this research, as you know, is very new. The circadian rhythm didn't win the Nobel Prize, I think, until 2016. A lot of smart functional medicine doctors. I know I heard you talk about the Chinese medicine clock in relation to sleep and body function and those types of things. We've known about that for a long time, but this science didn't really become conclusive and things we know for a fact until 2016. So this is a bit of a fledgling science, and now we're starting to get more and more data on exercise and circadian rhythms and nutrient availability and circadian rhythms.
It's funny that you mentioned eating one way and training another. And obviously, a lot of our followers are people who are into working out. So I was listening to Tom Platz yesterday on a reel. So if anybody doesn't know who Tom Platz is, he was an elite bodybuilder. I think he did second or third in his best year in the Olympia. He was known for having the best legs. And he said he decided in the late 70s, early 80s that he was going to go train with Arnold Schwarzenegger and do Arnold's diet and Arnold's workout. And Arnold happened to work out 6 times a week, do a body part 3 times a week. And Arnold was a big protein guy. Platz said that he worked out with him and all he did was get weaker and fatter, which is the antithesis of what you want as a bodybuilder. Within that, he said he thought he was going to give up this as a profession, being a bodybuilder, took 3 weeks off and he grew. And then he realized his body was different than Arnold's in that he needed recovery. He needed carbohydrates. So as really speaking then, they didn't know all this technical scientific stuff on how to do that. They would just trial and error. So I know you're busy and you've given a lot of great takeaways. Somebody says, I need to check my circadian rhythm. What does it mean for me? Give them 5 chewable, digestible takeaways that they can start on Monday morning, if you will.
All right. So number 1, the first light that hits your eyes each day should be natural light. That is not an easy box to tick, but don't wake up and check your phone. Try not to wake up and turn on artificial lights. Number 2, your evening routine, right? Your eyes need to perceive the dimming of light as the day goes on. And one of the best ways to fall asleep sooner and have better quality sleep is rule number 1. First light in your eyes should should be natural. And that actually increases melatonin in the brain, increases melatonin peripherally. And it does a whole host of great things. And so then when you start to check your evening routine can then facilitate an improved morning routine. So then we have things like blocking artificial blue light would probably be number 3. So you use your filters on your screen, filters on your phones. A really great feature that I don't think a lot of people take or utilize as much as they should I think it's called dark mode. It's where the writing or the text on your screen is white and the backgrounds are black. That's immensely better for your eyes and can help facilitate less damage to the eye. So one of the interesting things with blue light is the way it damages your eye, because it's such an intense spectrum of light. The damage to the eye, or like acute macular degeneration or some of those types of things, slow down circadian rhythm because the light can't flow through the eye and facilitate the electrical signal in the brain properly. So utilizing things like dark mode, blocking blue light, the orange screen filters is a really good one for number 3, I guess we were on. Nutrient timing would be a big one. So if you are going to have carbohydrates in the evening, no later than 6 o'clock, and it must be 4 hours before bed, that should allow you, as long as you're not immensely metabolically dysfunctional, to sort of make that switch where insulin can come down, leptin can come up. So number 5, grounding.
I love it. That was great. Now, who would have thought that they would tune in today and talk about circadian rhythm? Because most people will have trouble spelling it. It's a great conversation piece. We've now added this without question as a nuanced niche to longevity. It's a way to live your life. It's a way to train. And by the way, you talked about that first sunlight in the morning. Some guy with a big podcast called Dr. Andrew Huberman, he talks about that all the time. So I think you probably hear him in the background going, yeah, man, keep going. That's what I'm saying. You keep going, you keep learning, you keep delivering on the information. It was great. Rob Jacobs, Dr. Rob Silverman, Proven Health Alternatives.